And there was something in there about drivenness is a form of hyperactivity. And I was nothing if not driven. And the second thing was something about interpersonal intuition and how often people with ADHD can walk into a room and they can just read the energy.
Welcome back, everyone, to Peace and Plenty in 20. I'm your host, Janine Deramo, midlife transformational coach. And I am so very excited for my guest today. It's been a long time coming. And if you have not heard of Tracy Otsuka, get ready to be blown away. She is a certified ADHD coach and the host of the ADHD for Smartass Women podcast. Her book, which, by the way, has been so instrumental in my own personal life, is of the same name. It has been named Amazon Editor's top 20 best nonfiction book of 2024. By the way, her podcast that I just referenced, Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, has over 8 million downloads. Is that correct?
Yes, and I want to stop you. I mean, I love the accolades, obviously, but Amazon, my book was chosen as Amazon Editor's best book, one of their best books of 2024. So it wasn't the best one, but
Understood.
it was still, a huge honor.
It is a huge honor, but thank you for the clarification.
Yeah.
I also want to mention that your expertise and your experience as an adult living with ADHD has brought you many opportunities being all over TV, television, CBS, ABC, and also you are sharing all of your knowledge and your leadership in this field on other platforms. I know you moderate a Facebook group with over 100,000 members. So I want to dive right in. But before we talk about your expertise, I want to go back to the beginning because I think
Mm,
it's very important for a lot of my women listeners and viewers to kind of understand this journey of where you are now and where you started. So I wanted to just ask you personally, because I've spoken to so many women who are diagnosed with ADHD and so many women who suspect they might be. I want to know from you personally, what made you suspect
mhm.
that this might be something that you had or something that you potentially could actually have a diagnosis for? Tell me and walk me through that journey for you of what that looked like and kind of what the symptoms were.
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to finally meet you face to face, and to be here speaking with your audience. So, for me, and I'm trying to remember what I think it's called the mom factor. My son was diagnosed. He was diagnosed at 12. I almost fell off my chair when the doctor who evaluated him told us it was ADHD because I thought if you have ADHD, it means you're not very smart, you're all over the place, and you are not destined for success. And what I knew about my son is, man, when he was into something, he was all in. He would learn it up, down, sideways better than anyone. And so the diagnosis did not make sense to me. So we ended up going to a psychologist who came highly rated. Um, she was in our town. She was supposedly an expert on ADHD. She met with our entire family. She met with just my son. And then she met with my husband and me. And she sat us down and told us we needed to wait. What did she say? Gosh, now I've already forgotten it. How could I? We needed to reduce our son's expectations because he was far too ambitious and he would be disappointed in life.
Hmm.
And when I heard that, my only thought was, why would you reduce any child's expectations? I don't care if you have a child who has been diagnosed with an intellectual disability. No way, no how. So, of course, we never went back. And I started to do research on ADHD because I realized I don't understand what it is. And what they're saying it is does not fit with my son. Sure, we had issues where, he um, primarily schoolwork. He was supposedly gifted in math, but
Mhm.
anything more than 10 problems, he would check out. Everything was a struggle. And we had a daughter that was 3 years older than my son, Marcus, and she was just a piece of cake. And so my husband and I would go around thinking, we'd see other kids that were unruly and falling apart and, a disaster in school. And we would literally, with our nose up in the air, think, get your crap together. Thinking, oh my gosh, it must be the way the child is being parented.
Mhm.
And then, of course, we had my son. And my son was pretty much a challenge from the get go, but he was fun. He
Yep.
always had this little glimmer in his eye and was doing things he wasn't supposed to be doing. But then he would come up with these really interesting ideas and thoughts. And he just was so smart. And so I'm doing all this research, trying to figure out that juxtaposition with Marcus. And lo and behold, it was the second time I read Ned Hallowell and John Brady's book, Driven to Distraction. And there was something in there about drivenness is a form of hyperactivity. And I was nothing if not driven. And the second thing was something about interpersonal intuition and how often people with ADHD can walk into a room and they can just read the energy and not in a woo woo way. You have to understand if your brain is not always reliable, you start to focus and work on your other senses. And so those two things were me. But again, most women with ADHD, their symptoms don't look like the typical boy symptoms, where they're annoying, they're talking back, they're loud, they're just kind of bratty. And that is because 72 girls with ADHD have 2 times the rate of inattention than boys do. So instead of being bratty and getting the services, they actually tend to be people pleasers and they will sit in the back of the classroom. If you've got inattentive ADHD, I'm combined type, I'm very hyperactive. But the inattentive ADHD girls kind of look like they're in their own dream world. They don't even realize they're in school, let alone the class they're in, until the teacher calls on them. And then they're like, oh. And so in their brain, boys are externalizing their symptoms. They're getting into trouble. Girls internalize their symptoms. They start beating themselves up in their head, like, well, why can't I do what all these other, classmates can do? Why am I struggling to get my homework done? Why am I struggling to pay attention? And so instead of being diagnosed with ADHD, instead of being hold on, let me rephrase that. Instead of
Makes
being
perfect
diagnosed
sense to
with
me in my brain.
Instead of being diagnosed with ADHD, they are diagnosed with anxiety and
Right.
depression. And they may have a little bit of all of those.
Mhm.
But for many women and people, um, if you treat the underlying ADHD, a lot of the anxiety, maybe all of the anxiety and the depression resolve. So I kind of went off on a tangent, but in truth, for me, I always was kind of crazy and out there. I was very entrepreneurial. I would do things like I was practicing law. I was bored. I'm like, I can't do this for the rest of my life. And it wasn't that I didn't like law. It was, oh my gosh, this great, bright, shiny world, There's so much to do. I can't just do one thing. So I quit law and I started a high-end women's wear company. No experience in women's wear whatsoever, but within 8 months, we were in Saks Fifth Avenue, Neiman Marcus, and Nordstrom. So, things like that. Like, how did I have, like, what was I thinking? Um, and my, I learned early on, being somewhat of a people pleaser, that I got a lot of positive attention if I did really well in school, even though I had to work harder than everybody. And so I always thought I must just not be as smart.
Mhm.
Um, and so what I realized is the more that I achieved, the more positive attention I got. So
Right.
I would just work as hard as I possibly could to get that attention. Now, something happens. I call it maturity onset ADHD. We now know as we age, um, estrogen modulates dopamine. And when you think about the times in your life when, and dopamine is what our brains don't make enough of. This is what causes ADHD.
Mhm.
This is when we, why we struggle with executive functions, which is really what ADHD is. So planning, scheduling, time management, sometimes emotional dysregulation or emotional regulation. We get really upset about things or really joyful about things. So I realized that all of a sudden, when I started head into my 40s or mid 40s, when perimenopause starts rearing its head, your body, your brain is actually making less dopamine. And as you're aging. And so what ended up happening for me was I had developed so much confidence around being this person of action. And then all of a sudden, I didn't even know where my confidence was.
Yeah.
And I think it was primarily because I already had a bad working memory. My working memory went to hell.
Yeah.
And when you can't rely on what did that person say? What did I just do? Like I literally could not remember. That really affects your confidence. And so I started to develop anxiety. And I used to joke about, I don't have anxiety. I cause anxiety for other people because I'm so demanding and I'm very perfectionistic. And so it was that combination of symptoms plus this sense of restlessness and not having enough time and what was I going to do with my life and I hadn't done enough. Nothing is ever enough. So does that answer your question?
100%. And in the meantime, what you also did was really paint the picture how I think there's this real struggle when we get to perimenopause. Maybe the word's not struggle, but realization, because that's kind of what happened with me. How old were you when you were diagnosed?
You know what? I was not diagnosed for years after that. But
Okay.
what I had done, I had gone to all kinds of, you know, doctors and like I went to a hormone specialist, and she completely, she said, "Oh, you have a thyroid problem." I had no thyroid issue whatsoever. I went to a psychologist and I was like, "Do I have anxiety?" And she told me, "No, she was Chinese and she said, I'm half Japanese. She said, "It's an Asian thing. We're such perfectionists. So that's what it is." And then finally, I went to a neurologist and was tested for Parkinson's. So,
Interesting.
because all of a sudden, I always, when I wanted to get something done, like I said, I am nothing if not driven. I would figure it out, I would get it done, and I couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
It was like I was up against a wall, and all of those things that used to be so easy for me. So, one of the things I loved to do was entertain.
Mhm.
And I could have, 20 people over for dinner and wouldn't even think twice about it. I could not I could barely cook for myself because I couldn't read a cookbook anymore.
Right.
All the timing was completely screwed up. I would literally have a pot and I'd be sitting in my kitchen and I'd know company was coming. I had no sense of scheduling. I was bad before, but now no sense of scheduling. So all I could do is just keep my head down and just keep working really hard. And I'd be in the kitchen with a pot, literally spinning with the pot because I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know where to put the pot. Like all of these things that I could do, I could no longer do. And I
Yeah.
didn't understand why, which is why, I was tested for Parkinson's because we were really thinking, is there some sort of, dementia going on?
And then so what after you had that test, what happened?
Well, she said, no, it's
Right.
not that.
Right.
And it wasn't until my son was diagnosed 8 months later
Mm.
where, because none of the other symptoms really made sense.
Right.
And this is what happens to women, right? They go in to see a doctor, see a clinician who supposedly knows about ADHD, and they're told things like, no, of course not. It's not ADHD. You got through college. It's not ADHD. You're not a mess. Your house isn't a mess. your car isn't a mess. Like they don't understand what ADHD looks like in women. And so what you end up with is a lot of classically successful women with ADHD who don't understand that it's ADHD. And so they may be, in the C-suite, totally high powered, killing it at work. But then they come home and they can't hold it together at all.
Right.
The dinner, what? Are we supposed to eat dinner? And so because they struggle at home, they cannot even see their success. They still see themselves as a failure. It
Yep.
doesn't matter how good they are in their career.
And this is to me the tragedy in women that either are diagnosed or don't know they're diagnosed and feel this sense of, because that's how I was, feel this sense of shame
Mm-hmm.
that I am able to, I mean, I've had multiple jobs. I started I mean, I've always kind of been in education and coaching, but I've done other things in between, selling jewelry, and, I was making scrapbooks for people at one point, always, and I always have to be in school. I always have to be learning something new. And so people look at you from the outside and give you accolades, and just like in school, like, when I was growing up, but the hidden the hidden shame and the hidden feeling of like they don't know that I just rewashed the same load of laundry 3 times because it's been
Yes.
sitting there, right? Or the shame of like everyone thinks I have it all together, but I really don't. And like so it messes with your identity almost. And for me, my middle daughter was diagnosed, very similar to you, and I think a lot of women do recognize these signs in themselves because there is a genetic component is I started doing the research, and one of the things for me that was so difficult, which I never even knew this term until I listened to a podcast about it that was for my daughter, was this idea of task initiation.
Mm-hmm.
I knew all of the things that I had to be doing or was supposed to be doing, but unless it was shiny enough or exciting enough, I just could not start that task. So, as I'm talking through all this, what would you say, as a coach, um, and I am in the same coaching program that you are, so I feel like I'm talking to a celebrity because they mentioned you, during my class. Um, as a coach, since we are not doctors that can diagnose, what do you say? Because I'm sure you have tons of people that come to you and friends and just people that have read your book and listen to your podcast. What do you recommend if somebody is thinking like you and I were, could there be something else going on here? Like what do you recommend as first steps?
Let me just close the loop first, if I may, so that your audience understands what you were just saying.
Okay.
Our ADHD brains are brains of interest. That really is the key. When we are interested, we're going to move hell and high water and we're going to get that thing done,
Right.
right? It's when we are not interested. And so much of ADHD, I think, for women is about gender roles, social stereotypes, and sexism. Women are told from the time they're little tiny girls that somehow they are better at taking care of small humans than men are, right? And so that is then where we beat ourselves up because, well, all the other women can do it.
Right.
And they don't understand that, you know what, that they're just socialized to believe that. It is
Right.
not necessarily true. There are some men that are going to be much better at those caretaking roles than women. And so that is where the shame comes from, I think.
Yeah,
That's where we beat
I
ourselves
agree.
up. And that is why ADHD women, um, there is a 24% chance that if you have ADHD and you are a woman, you have attempted to take your life. So
Mhm.
it's serious.
That's what I said.
Whereas if
Why
you
it's a
look at
trend.
men
Yeah.
with ADHD, Janine, it's women's rates are 3 times higher than men and 8 times higher than women without ADHD.
Mhm.
So I think so much of it, and especially once we get older and we have kids and there's a family and there's a household, that is when so many women who may have done just fine when they were younger,
Right.
but now juggling all these, all these other tasks. And this is boring work. It's like Groundhog Day. It never ends. And our brains, frankly, are
Right.
just too brilliant for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
It is boring. Okay, so let me, your question about getting diagnosed. I think a lot of women, I hear this over and over again, they feel really nervous about being dismissed, misunderstood, or told it's just anxiety or it's just depression, right? And
Mhm.
I've heard so many stories of, oh my gosh, I felt like I was like, you know, like I have a drug problem, and they're cynical and are treating me like, oh, the only reason I'm here is for medication, which is so ridiculous because you wouldn't be meant to feel that way for most anything else,
Correct.
right?
Correct.
So, what I always say first and foremost, because many clinicians don't understand what ADHD looks like in women. So, you have got to go in prepared. Um, Educate yourself. Learn how ADHD shows up in women. Track your symptoms, like write down specific examples of how ADHD shows up in your life. I have a podcast, I think it's episode 40, where I talk about what to do, if you're going to go in and get diagnosed. And we also have a worksheet because if you look at the DSM-5, which is how, we diagnose ADHD, those symptoms are all for boys.
Right.
So, it's not going to make any difference. I mean, you're not going to be able to relate to most of those symptoms versus if you really sit down and think about, what are the things that constantly show up for me in my ADHD and start writing them down. You do need to know that the symptoms should be present since childhood. It
Right.
does not mean that they have to be debilitating then. But like if I look back on my life, I always got in trouble for talking too much.
Mhm.
I always was moving. I mean, I started businesses from the time that I was 8 years old. So there were symptoms that were always there. I could not just sit still and quietly play. And every day it was a different craft. Like that was my thing. So really look back on your life and start putting together a list of the things that you've always wondered about. Because one of the things that I will say is if you've done your research and you're like, oh my gosh, for the first time in my life, I understand myself, this is the problem. And someone comes back to you, a clinician, and says, no, it's not ADHD, I say, go get, you know, go to another clinician.
Yep.
Because when we know,
We
we
know.
know.
Uh-huh. 100%. That
Um,
intuition is so strong.
what I would also say is you need a clinician who specializes in ADHD. Um, so I would ask people that you trust for referrals.
Yep.
If you don't have anyone, I would go to local directories like CHAD,
Yep.
Children's and Adults with ADD. I think that's what it stands for, or
Yep.
ADA. I can't remember what ADA stands for, or Attitude,
Yep.
Attitude magazine. They all have sections where there are clinicians there that obviously, if you're part of one of those organizations, ADHD is something that's important to you. And so you are just going to have more knowledge. If there's still, you can't find anybody, if you have a medical school maybe that's close by, I would call them. I would ask, do you have a psychiatry department? And see if there's anybody on their faculty that treats women with ADHD. I actually was diagnosed, and my daughter and my son, and my daughter's only been diagnosed once. My son had to be diagnosed 3 times just because of his age, and you have to keep updating it.
Right.
And I was diagnosed twice. And the last time so my entire family and me were diagnosed through Lori Peterson with e-diagnostic learning. And what I loved about, she's in Texas, but I'm in California. And so what I love about the way she diagnoses adult women is she does pretty much the full battery of neuropsych testing.
Mm,
So she does subjective testing and objective testing. I
okay.
never had an IQ test done before. And so having that kind of testing was really important because there were certain things that I always said, oh, I'm like Barbie. I hate math. Yet there was this one math class called trigonometry that I didn't get an A. I got an A plus. I got the highest grade in the class. So if someone who hates math can do that, then there must be something going on, right? And so once I went through her testing, I saw, well, these are the areas you're really strong in. And math was actually one of them. Even though my entire life I'd been telling myself, I'm like Barbie, I hate math. When really what the problem was, I hated geometry. I
Right.
struggle with like visual spatial
Facial,
stuff.
yep.
So it really is helpful if you can afford it. And I will say, I think she is very reasonable compared to what a lot of this testing can cost. And should I say she specializes in women? Well, she has ADHD, so
Right.
she really understands, and her team, real, and the psychologist on her staff, Abby, I think is her name. She also has been diagnosed with ADHD, so they really understand ADHD. So if there's nowhere local, I would say I highly recommend e-diagnostic learning. The one thing is you must ask whoever you're going to work with, how many women with ADHD have you treated?
Right.
And you don't want dozens, you want them to say hundreds, if not thousands, right? Um, is this helpful?
Extremely, extremely. And so I want to just go back to something you said, talking
Yeah.
about in the DSM-5, and in terms of the symptoms. So there is so much current research through, Attitude Magazine and Chad, and even as I'm going through ADCA, through the coaching, all of the research, I have to say, it's been fascinating to me that between myself, my daughter, my other daughter who has anxiety, I mean, we have a Rolodex of psychologists and psychiatrists and some of the best. But unfortunately, again, if they're not specializing in ADHD and they don't have some of the knowledge or newest research, I am learning things in this course that are blowing my mind, that I feel like I knew a lot about ADHD, having been a teacher and having, going through this with my daughter and doing all my reading. And I also want to mention the point that you said, like when I was diagnosed and I mentioned it to some of my friends or even my mom, they were like, "What? You don't have
Yeah.
ADHD. Look what you do." But number one, they don't see how much work it takes for me to do some of the things that I do. Number two, some of it I'm faking,
Yeah.
right? Um, and number three, I think that's also because there is this stigma of it just looks like young boys bouncing off the wall, where no, a lot of times it can be girls, like you said, and from childhood, I had to go back and think about it. And I was a very strong student. Um, but I was constantly getting my seat changed for talking.
Yes.
I remember getting, they were called yellow slips. So if you forgot a book at home or your
Mhm.
notebook at home, I would have to bring it home and get it signed by my parents. And I would get screamed at. And the shame when I look back, because I remember thinking, like, I'm not trying to do this on purpose. And I know I'm supposed to be this top student. So there was that juxtaposition of like, well, am I really that smart? So that even as you mentioned confidence in midlife, I think I struggled with confidence back then because I was so confused as to why I was struggling in these areas. And I didn't figure this out till I was 47 years old, like those light bulb moments. So I think it's important. Um, Everything that you are saying is making sense and is so important for women to hear, that it doesn't have to like look a certain way. And there are so many different presentations. And even I think it's in your book where you talk about hyperactivity doesn't mean it's outward hyperactivity. It's hyperactivity in here,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And then again, and then come perimenopause or menopause and the estrogen drops and dopamine drops and now we're really screwed
You're
because
really
now we
screwed.
really feel that shame, right? Now it's all doubled and with the social expectations of what we're doing as moms. So I just feel that to your point, it's so important for people to I loved all of your tips and I'm going to put that in the show notes too, that if they can't find someone, like you need to find the right people, ask the right questions, keep track of what's going on with you, because I do think that it's important not necessarily to have like a piece of paper, that says like I have ADHD, but for me anyway, it was such a relief and a
Yeah.
release of shame to be like, oh, that's why I struggle with XYZ. It's okay that I like,
Yeah.
it was such a relief for me. I don't know if you had the same kind of experience.
Um, I know a lot of people struggle with grief when they're first
Mm,
diagnosed. What could have been? But I think for women who, are traditionally successful,
mhm.
there's less of that because we just went out there and kept doing things because, early on we learned that if we're constantly in action, we're not in our head and
Right.
we actually get accolades for that. We make money because of it, all of that. Um, For me, it was more, oh my gosh, I finally understand my brain
Mhm,
because I was the kind of person who literally from the time I was 27, I started practicing law. And I remember at 27, I was in my first career counselor's office, and when I left law, my parents didn't say anything, but I had friends' parents who were like, what are you doing?
mm,
This doesn't make any sense.
right,
And so, I was always wondering, why do I do this? But I didn't have any fear. That was the
right.
crazy part. I was just like, I'm just going to go do it. Why not? And I couldn't understand why I was so different than other women that I knew,
Mm,
and I'm not the kind of person to run like I never was to run with a girl pack.
right.
I was kind of much more lone wolf
Hmm.
doing my own thing. I always felt I had respect of the girl packs because of everything I did,
Hmm.
but I often felt like an outsider. I still do,
Yeah. Yeah.
where no matter if everybody else is doing this, you can be assured I'm doing that.
Right.
It doesn't matter what industry that I'm in. I'm always looking for, is there a better way to do it? Is there a different way to do it? I mean, I'm an ADHD coach, but I don't do any ADHD coaching like a normal ADHD coach would do.
Right.
What
Right.
I am interested in is the foundational work. Okay, now that you know you have ADHD, who are you? What is most important to you? What is it that you are meant to do with your life?
Mhm.
Those to me are the key questions because I don't think ADHD is a productivity problem. I think it's an identity problem.
Mm. Right.
For our entire lives, we tried to be who, they say we're supposed to be.
Yes.
And then we're not really figuring out, no, 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 but who are you really? And that has always been what I've been interested in. Read every book, did every training, went
Yep.
to every seminar, yet still, you know, it would get better, because I go through periods where I've got to go do this stuff because I'm struggling with something.
Yeah.
I get there, okay, I learned this about myself, and then I go back on my merry way
Right.
until it rears its head again. And then I'm like, shit, what did I learn about myself before? Like I couldn't remember.
That's
And
right.
so for me, the most important piece about this is really figuring out that sweet spot of what are your values, what's important to you, what are your strengths, what do you just naturally do well and you've always done well, what are the talents you've built skills around and turned into a superpower, of the many passions that you have, which is the one you should pursue, and then the neighborhood of your purpose. So if you're in that sweet spot and you're constantly acting there, you're going to be okay.
That's right.
Whereas, because you're going to move things forward, right? You're going to be moving things forward in a way that makes sense for your brain. Versus what most of us do is we try this, we try that, we try this, none of it connects.
Right.
And so then we feel like a failure because we're not growing ourselves or our careers.
That's right. And that brings me to the last thing I wanted to talk about with you, which is basically why you wrote this book is I love that word superpower because it just because we maybe don't do things by the book or like I know with my daughter, I'll never forget her second grade teacher said, and my daughter is so smart and so creative. But her second grade teacher said she's just one of those kids that doesn't like fit inside the box of school, right? And this is how, and in our society, and especially I don't remember what part of California you're in, but I'm in just outside of Manhattan in New Jersey. And
Mm.
where we live, there's a certain way that people look and act and live. And I think it's so important that women who do have ADHD are able to shift all of those stories in their minds about like all the things that they haven't been able to do well and say what you just said. What's my purpose? What am I passionate about? And what actually makes this neurodivergent brain so brilliant? Not and again, not following the traditional rules feels like you might be doing something bad because we're people pleasers and perfectionists and good girls. So when we're doing something differently, your book to me was very empowering in the sense that it's okay. And it's not just okay, it's brilliance and it's a superpower. And you actually have the ability to go further than other people either expected you to or that you maybe put limitations on yourself. So I know I'm rambling because that's what we do, but I want you to just comment on that and why you wrote this book and how you share this message with women that listen, this really is a superpower. It is not a detriment.
Okay, so I never call ADHD a superpower because if you told me you could have all your brilliance, but you could also have great working memory, are you kidding me? Oh my God, I would take
That
that in a
is
heartbeat.
fair. That is very fair.
However, there are traits of ADHD that we can very likely turn into a superpower.
Okay.
My number one value is to challenge the status quo.
Mm,
And so I know if I have two options, one of them is going to be like, ah, you're going to do the same thing over and over. This one, the other branch, is you can change something, you can do something different, you can challenge the status quo. I know that if I choose the challenge the status quo option, I'm going to be able to stick in that longer
right.
than I would the other one. So the more you learn how your brain works, the more likely you are going to be able to use the superpowers that you have built from your ADHD in a way that serves you.
Gotcha.
Because what I always say is, okay, everyone's telling you you're too much. Well, you tell me, have you ever met anyone who set the world on fire being too little?
Mm,
So we have this need to be original, to challenge the status quo, to love change, whereas most of the world is like clinging to what they've always known, right? We just thrive in an environment, and so maybe we need both kinds of people, right?
right.
Neurodivergent people and neurotypical people, because I know that my husband is very neurotypical and very linear, and I love that he then can do the things that I hate to do,
That's
right?
right. It's a
But
great
I always tell him,
symbiotic relationship.
yeah, I always tell him your life would be so boring without me because I am always the one who's looking for different things to do, different places to explore. We're in the process right now of we're going to sell our home. We live in the country on 6.5 acres. The house is too big. Our kids are both in New York City. I
Oh,
love New York. For me, New York, oh my gosh, just the stimulation. I just feel so
of
comfortable
course.
there.
Yes.
And so, we're thinking about, well, what can we do? And the other day I was talking to him about, well, where could we go next? And I said, I just talked to someone. Actually, she was a guest on my podcast and she had just moved to Mexico. And I'm like, why don't we go there? And my husband, the fear on his face.
Because he knew you weren't kidding.
No, I'm not kidding at all. I'm like, why
Exactly.
not? We're working on citizenship. I'm half German, and
Okay.
there's a
Yes.
new law now that I was born in Germany. My mother was German, but my father was American. He was a captain. He was a dentist, a captain in the army. And because of sexism, had my father been German, I would have immediately been granted German
Uh,
citizenship. But because it was my mother, I wasn't. And so now I and all my kids, I only have two of them, they were just automatically granted citizenship if you fill out
wow.
all this paperwork. So,
Right.
things like that. I think my husband would probably still live in the house that we lived in when we first moved in together,
Right.
or not moved in
Right.
together when we got married. So, I think you need both.
Yeah.
Too much of me is probably not a good thing, and too much of him certainly would be very boring.
Yes.
So, I think that bottom line, I have met thousands of women with ADHD, and I can say this without batting an eyelash because it is so true. I have never met a woman with ADHD who was not truly brilliant at something. And so our charge is to figure out, where does that brilliance lie? And the minute that we are working in that area of brilliance, we will have none. Maybe I'm exaggerating just a little bit because, if you're an entrepreneur, there's always things that you have to do that you don't want to do. But we will have very little of the executive function challenges that we would have in other areas where we have no interest and we are not brilliant. So, why wouldn't we stay in our area of brilliance, right?
Absolutely. And I love your point going back to, once you can understand how your brain works and combine that with knowing that you have to have a strong passion and interest in whatever it is that you're doing, and also knowing that trusting your intuition is so important. If you can align those things, you will feel so much more at peace and so much more alive. And guess what? For the parts like laundry that we struggle with, that's where you outsource. That's where I outsource. That was one of the first things I did when I realized
Absolutely.
this is not a strength of mine. And it's not because I'm a bad mom or a
No,
bad a home keeper. But going back to what you said earlier, we have been conditioned, and don't get me wrong, there are moments that I still feel guilty
yeah,
that I have someone here doing my laundry. But from the work that I've done and what I know about my brain now, I'm not laying on the couch eating bonbons watching someone do my laundry. I am outsourcing that part of what I am not good at and task initiation, so that I can use my time and energy to live into my brilliance and the exact thing that you were just talking about. And so I love that this book is out there. I recommend it to anybody that I think might be struggling, because I think it's so important to have this perspective and have this new take on, a diagnosis that's been around forever, but has really just not been properly understood. So I can't thank you enough for all the time that you gave me. I knew we wouldn't be able to keep it to 20 minutes. And to be
oh
honest,
my God.
we could talk for another 20 hours because
Yeah.
there's just so much in this field. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. I want to thank you for the inspiration. And again, I love coaching, but now that I've figured out that this is something that I personally struggle with and I can recognize in other people, I want to build on helping others just like you do. And don't stop. Keep doing the work that you're doing. And I'm going to put all the information in the show notes to everyone listening. Make sure you go and check out the obviously get the book, check out the podcast, and anything else, Tracy, that you would recommend they do.
Go to my website. Everything's there, tracyotsuka.com.
And I have one more thing I would recommend. So I, as a teacher, and I actually I got my master's in literacy. For those of you that are interested in reading it, but struggle with reading with your eyes, there is also something I like to call reading with your ears. And if you get it on Audible, I love that it's your voice because I have played this in my car hours and hours and hours. And the other thing is, I'll play it sometimes with my daughters in the car, not, kind of subtly like, maybe you should listen
Yeah.
to this and understand why finances might be so hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Just get
So,
her to invest, set it up, start when she's really young. I wish someone would have told me that, and just make it an automatic withdrawal every week, even if it's $5 a week. Once
right.
you set it up, our brains forget. So let that work for you.
That's right. And for any of you listening, that should have been that should have piqued your interest if finances are a thing, because that one of my favorite chapters in the book, because that's something that I struggle with. Again, thank you for being here. I adore your work. Keep doing what you're doing, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.